The arrival. The ferry cut through the morning fog like a blade through gauze. Behind it, the mainland shrank into a blur of gray and blue. Ahead, the outline of Block Island rose slowly from the mist. Cliffs crowned in green, the flash of a distant lighthouse, and the cry of gulls spiraling over the surf. For Elias Quinn, photographer and travel writer, this was supposed to be a quiet assignment. Rhode Island's coastal heartbeat, his editor had called it, a glossy magazine spread about nature trails, Victorian cottages, and sunsets over the sea. But the moment he saw the island emerge from the fog, something in his chest shifted. Block Island didn't look peaceful. It looked ancient. The ferry's horn sounded once, low and hollow. Elias slung his camera around his neck and leaned on the rail. Salt spray clung to his hair. A woman beside him, her jacket flapping in the wind, caught him staring. "You feel it too, huh?" she said. "Feel what?" "The weight." She nodded toward the cliffs. "They say this island's built on bones, wrecked ships, buried gold, souls that never left." Elias smiled politely. "Local legends sell postcards." "Maybe," she said, pulling her hood up, "but legends don't come from nowhere." By the time the ferry docked at Old Harbor, she had vanished into the crowd. Block Island was smaller than he'd imagined. Just a few square miles of winding roads, stone walls, and shingled cottages wrapped in hydrangeas. But its beauty had gravity. Everything seemed to hum faintly. The sea, the grass, even the air. He checked into a weathered Victorian inn called the Mariner's Rest, run by a woman named Mrs. Callahan, who looked like she'd been part of the island since time began. Her silver hair was wound tight, her blue eyes sharp as sea glass. "Room 3, top of the stairs," she said, handing him a brass key. "Faces the cliffs. You'll hear the foghorn when the wind's right." "Perfect," Elias said. "I'm here to photograph the lighthouses, the trails, maybe the old harbor if the weather holds." Mrs. Callahan studied him. "Most visitors come for the beaches. You're not most visitors, are you?" He shrugged. "Guess not." "Then watch yourself near the North Point. The cliffs up there like to keep secrets." She smiled thinly and disappeared into the kitchen. That night, Elias sat by the window with his camera and notebook, listening to the surf crash against the rocks below. The room smelled faintly of salt and cedar. On the desk he'd laid out his ferry ticket, a half-finished article draft, and an old map he'd picked up from a shop near the pier. Block Island, trails, lighthouses, and legends. In the corner of the map, someone had penciled a small X near the north coast and written a single word in faded ink. Revenant. He frowned. Probably a tourist prank, he thought. Still, something about that word, ghost, returner, unsettled him. He turned off the light and lay in bed. The wind rose, rattling the window panes. Somewhere far off, the foghorn moaned, long, low, mournful. And just before sleep claimed him, he thought he heard footsteps pacing slowly above his ceiling, except there was no floor above him. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the island. Elias packed his gear and followed the Clay Head Trail, a winding path through meadows and scrub that led toward the cliffs. Butterflies drifted between the milkweed. The sea below glittered like a blade. He stopped often, taking photos. A ruined fence, a cluster of wild roses, a lone crow perched on a weathered post. Then he reached the edge. From the cliff's lip, the Atlantic stretched forever, a living, breathing horizon. But the drop below made him dizzy. Jagged rocks, white spray, and what looked like the ribs of a ship half buried in the sand. He knelt, adjusted his lens, and zoomed in. Yes, the skeletal curve of a hull, timbers black with age, tangled with seaweed. He lowered the camera. "A shipwreck," he whispered. "Not just any wreck," said a voice behind him. Elias turned sharply. An old man stood a few yards back, tall and thin, wearing a sailor's cap bleached by sun and time. His eyes were gray as driftwood. "Didn't hear you coming," Elias said. "That's the Phoenix, or what's left of her. Went down in 1738. Cargo never found. Some say it was rum, some say it was silver." Elias scribbled a note. "You a local historian?" "Local, yes. Historian, no. Name's Jonas Pike. I keep the North Light." "The Lighthouse?" "Aye. Been watching her lamp 40 years now. She watches back." Elias hesitated. "Mind if I ask what you meant, it watches back?" He smiled without mirth. "This island's got a memory, son. Some places remember better than people do. You keep digging around the bones of it, and you'll wake something best left dreaming." With that, he tipped his cap and walked away down the path, leaving Elias alone with the wind and the endless sea. That evening, Elias drove to the North Light, a granite tower rising at the island's tip. The sun was melting into the ocean, painting the waves with fire. The lighthouse stood stark against the glow, a sentinel, watching centuries drift by. Inside, the air smelled of oil and salt. He found Jonas tending the lamp, trimming the wick with careful hands. "Thought you'd come," Jonas said. "They always do, the curious ones." "I just wanted to see the light," Elias said. "It's beautiful." Jonas nodded. "Built her in 1867, after too many ships kissed the rocks. Before that, this coast was a graveyard. Pirates, merchants, whalers, all met the same end when the fog rolled in." Elias set up his tripod. "You said the island remembers. How?" Jonas looked past him toward the sea. "Ever hear of Captain Mordecai Slate?" Elias shook his head. "Pirate, devil of the Atlantic, they called him. He used to anchor in the coves here, trade rum for safe harbor. Some say he buried gold in the cliffs before the crown caught him. When they hanged him in Newport, he cursed the island, said no ship would find peace here again." Elias shivered. "Stories," he said finally. "Legends." Jonas's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "Then tell me, boy, why does that lantern sometimes answer ours?" Outside, the night had deepened into velvet darkness. The sea whispered against the stones. Elias turned his camera toward the horizon and clicked the shutter once, twice, 3 times. When he looked at the last photo, his heart stumbled. There, faint but visible, was a second light, hovering low over the waves. Not the beacon's reflection, not a boat, a small, flickering glow, like a lantern swaying in unseen hands. He looked up again. The light was gone. But in the hush between the waves, he thought he heard laughter, distant, hollow, echoing from the sea.
The next morning, the wind came hard off the Atlantic, sharp, cold, and full of grit. Elias woke before dawn, the foghorns still echoing in his head like a dream that refused to fade. He replayed last night's images on his camera screen. Most were ordinary. The lighthouse haloed in mist, waves breaking on the rocks, the fading glow of sunset. But one picture, the one that mattered, stopped him cold. The lantern light. He zoomed in until the pixels blurred. It wasn't a reflection or a passing ship. It hung above the waterline, swaying, small but bright, a single flame lost in endless gray. "Captain Mordecai Slate," he murmured. The name fit the scene too perfectly. Elias packed his camera, notebook, and the old map with the penciled word Revenant. Something told him the two were linked. He stepped out into the cold air, intent on finding answers. The village was just waking up. Fishing boats rocked in the harbor. Gulls screeched overhead. Mrs. Callahan stood on the inn's porch with a mug of coffee, watching him with her sharp blue eyes. "You were at the Lighthouse last night," she said. "Yes," Elias replied. "I met Jonas Pike." She nodded slowly. "Jonas doesn't speak much to strangers. If he told you stories, you'd best remember. Every story here is a warning." "What can you tell me about Captain Slate?" Her expression tightened. "Enough to say you shouldn't be asking." "I'm writing a travel piece. History sells. Readers love a good pirate." "Then write about lighthouses and sunsets, Mr. Quinn. Leave the dead their peace." Before he could reply, she turned and went inside, the door shutting firmly behind her. By noon, Elias found himself in the Island Historical Society, a small clapboard building smelling of dust and sea salt. The curator, a bespectacled woman named Mara Latham, looked up from her desk when he entered. "Can I help you?" "I'm researching Captain Mordecai Slate, pirate, early 1700s. I'm told he used Block Island as a hideout." She raised an eyebrow. "That name hasn't been spoken here in years." "So he's real?" "Real enough." She opened a drawer and produced a cracked leather ledger. Slate's ship, the Crimson Wraith, was wrecked off the northern cliffs in 1738, supposedly carrying stolen Spanish silver. He leaned closer. "That matches what Jonas said." Mara gave a small smile. "Jonas says a lot, but here's the strange part. No official record of the wreck. Just rumors, sightings, a few artifacts washed ashore. The islanders buried what they found. They said the sea didn't want his treasure back." "What about the name Revenant?" Elias asked. Mara froze. "Where did you hear that?" He pulled out the old map. Her face paled. "That word isn't from any archive. It's from folklore. They say Slate swore that if anyone touched his gold, he'd rise again, a revenant, a restless soul. Some nights after storms, fishermen claim they see his ship sailing through the fog, lantern burning red." Elias felt the shiver crawl up his arms. "Maybe that's what I saw last night." Mara's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then you should pray the sea forgets you." Elias spent the afternoon hiking north again, tracing the map's faint paths toward the cliffs. The wind had shifted. Gulls wheeled above him in frantic circles. Down below, the wreckage he'd photographed yesterday was almost gone, swallowed by tide and sand. He crouched near the edge, camera poised. Something glinted between the rocks, a flash of metal. He slid carefully down, gripping the roots and shale until his boots hit wet sand. The tide hissed against the stones. There, half buried in kelp, was a silver coin, tarnished but unmistakably old. He brushed it clean, revealing a cross and worn lettering, 1740, Nueva España. Spanish, just like the legend said. He pocketed it, heart pounding. That was when he heard a whisper. Not wind, not waves, a low voice close to his ear. Return what's ours. He spun around. No one, just sea spray and the hollow roar of surf. Then came a sound beneath his feet, a creak, as if wood shifted under sand. He stepped back. The tide sucked away, revealing a fragment of hull, black and waterlogged, rising like a rib cage from the sea. The wreckage was moving. He stumbled away as a swell crashed over it. When the wave retreated, the beach was empty again, except for the faint outline of footprints in the wet sand. Not his. They led from the water toward the cliffs and vanished. That night he couldn't sleep. The wind hammered the windows, and each time the foghorn sounded, it seemed closer. He laid the silver coin on the desk. Under the lamplight, its surface shimmered faintly, as if catching light from an unseen flame. He began typing notes for his article. Block Island, a place of quiet trails and painted cottages, hides the restless bones of the Atlantic. Beneath its cliffs sleep the ships that never made port and the men who refuse to be forgotten. He stopped typing. From somewhere down the hall came a faint tapping. Slow, measured, like footsteps. He opened the door. The hallway was dark. At the far end, the figure of a man in a sailor's coat stood motionless, lantern in hand.
The morning after the ship appeared, Block Island felt different. The sky was too clear, the sea too still. Even the gulls seemed muted, circling high but silent. Elias walked the narrow lanes toward town, the coin heavy in his pocket, his mind full of fog and flame. At the Island Historical Society, Mara Latham was cataloging maps when he burst in. "I saw his ship," Elias said. Mara looked up sharply. "You should stop saying things like that." "I have proof." He laid his camera on the table, scrolling to the photograph. She leaned close. The image was washed with mist, the horizon a blur. But there, unmistakably, was a faint outline of sails and a lantern burning red. Mara crossed herself. "Good Lord." "It's real," Elias said. "The Crimson Wraith, I saw it, and he called my name." "Then you're in danger." He laughed shakily. "You sound like Jonas." "He's not wrong," she said. "There's a story in the old logs from 1803. A fisherman found a coin like yours, said he saw a ship appear in the fog. A week later, they found his boat drifting empty off the north shore. Only thing inside
was a lantern still burning. Elias ran his hand through his hair. There has to be an explanation. Maybe I'm overtired. Or maybe the island remembers, Mara interrupted softly. Maybe Captain Slate keeps his promise. That afternoon, Elias took his notebook and hiked inland. The trail wound between stone walls and wild meadows, leading to the ruins of an old farmstead long abandoned. According to the map, the penciled X, Revenant, lay somewhere nearby. He found it after an hour, a small rise overlooking the sea, crowned by a crooked oak. The grass here grew thick and uneven. Something, instinct or the faint scent of salt and metal, told him to stop. He dropped to his knees, scraping at the earth with his hands. Within minutes, his fingers struck wood. He cleared the dirt away. A small chest emerged, rotted but intact. The lock was corroded. One twist with a stone broke it. Inside lay a handful of silver coins, black with age, and a folded scrap of parchment sealed with wax. Elias's pulse quickened. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the brittle page. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, and chillingly deliberate. To the one who dares disturb my rest, know that the sea keeps her debts, and the dead their word. The silver is cursed, bound to my blood and name. Return it to the deep, or join me beneath the waves. Mordecai Slate. A gust of wind tore across the hill, scattering sand and leaves. Elias clutched the page, heart hammering. Somewhere, far off, thunder rumbled. He looked down at the chest. The silver seemed to shimmer faintly, as if reflecting unseen light. Then faintly he heard it again, the whisper. Return what's ours. He stumbled backward, the letter clutched to his chest. The sea below churned, white foam against black rock. For an instant, he thought he saw shapes moving beneath the waves, shadows rising, writhing, reaching toward shore. He ran. By dusk, the storm had broken. Waves lashed the cliffs like cannon fire. Elias sat by the window, the silver coins laid out before him, the letter flickering in lantern light. He couldn't write, couldn't think. He poured himself a drink from the decanter on the sideboard, something amber, sharp. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. Then came a knock at the door. He opened it to find Jonas Pike soaked to the bone, lantern in hand. "You found it," Jonas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you've read the letter." Elias nodded. Jonas stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. "Slate buried that silver to bind his curse, said no man could touch it and live free. You've stirred it up again." I laughed bitterly. "So what, I throw it back into the ocean and everything's fine?" Jonas's gaze was grave. "Maybe, maybe not. But if you keep it, it'll take you like it took the others." "The others?" Jonas nodded toward the sea. "Every ship that's gone down since 1738. Every man who thought he could claim what belonged to the captain." Elias sat heavily on the bed. "Why me?" Jonas hesitated. "Because your name isn't Quinn, is it?" Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" "Your family, your mother's maiden name, Slate." Elias felt the room tilt. "How do you—" "I've seen your eyes before, same gray as his. Blood remembers, even if you don't." Elias stared at him. "You're saying I'm related to him?" Jonas nodded slowly. "You've come full circle, boy. The curse has waited for its own." The storm raged all night. Waves hammered the cliffs like cannon fire. Elias sat by the window, the silver coins laid out before him, the letter flickering in lantern light. Every instinct screamed to end it, to hurl the silver into the sea and be done. But part of him, that stubborn, reckless part that had always chased stories to their edge, wanted to see this through. He wrote a note in his journal. "If I do not return, let this record tell what happened. The past has teeth. The sea keeps what's it owed." Then he packed the chest, slung his camera over his shoulder, and stepped into the storm. The cliffs were alive with wind and spray. Lightning tore the sky, revealing the North Lights' beams slicing through rain. Jonas was waiting near the rocks, lantern glowing dimly. "You're sure about this?" Jonas shouted over the wind. "No, but I have to try." Together they climbed down the slick stones toward the surf. The tide was monstrous, waves crashing like thunder. Elias set the chest down, pried it open, and lifted one of the coins. It was ice cold, heavy with something that felt alive. "Return it to the deep," Jonas said. Elias hurled the coin into the waves. It vanished with a hiss. He threw another, then another, each one swallowed by the sea. When the last coin left his hand, the wind seemed to pause, just for an instant, as if the world were holding its breath. Then through the mist, the crimson wraith appeared. Its black sails rose from the water, glowing faintly with spectral fire. Figures stood along the deck, silhouettes silent and waiting. At their head, a tall man in a tattered coat, eyes like coals. Captain Mordecai Slate. He raised a ghostly hand. "Blood for silver," the voice boomed, echoing across sea and stone. Elias took a step forward. "Take it back! It's yours!" The captain's eyes burned brighter. "And so are you." The sea surged upward, a wall of white and darkness. Jonas shouted, reaching for Elias, but the waves struck like thunder. For a moment, everything was water, light, and silence. When Elias woke, dawn had broken. The sea was calm, the cliffs quiet. The chest was gone. Jonas knelt beside him, breathing hard. "It's done," Jonas said. "He's gone." Elias sat up slowly, soaked and shivering. The horizon was empty, save for a faint glow fading into mist. He reached for his pocket. The letter and coins were gone. In their place lay a single smooth stone, etched faintly with the symbol of a compass rose. Jonas smiled faintly. "A token. Maybe he's finally at rest." Elias looked out to sea. The air felt different, like something lighter somehow, as if the island itself had exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. The curse, it seemed, had lifted. That evening, Elias returned to the inn. Mrs. Callahan was waiting on the porch, eyes bright with unspoken knowledge. "You did it," she said, nodded. "The island remembers kindness too. You've given it peace." Elias smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time someone told that story.
When the storm cleared, the island seemed new. The wind had softened, the air washed clean of its salt fury. Along the cliffs, sunlight poured down in gold rivers, turning the wet rocks to mirrors. For the first time since Elias had arrived, Block Island truly felt alive. Jonas Pike was gone when Elias woke. Only the faint tracks of his boots in the sand remained, leading toward the lighthouse. The sea rolled gentle and endless, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Elias sat by the shore for a long time, camera in his lap, the stone with the compass rose warm in his palm. He wasn't sure whether what had happened the night before was real, or some fever dream conjured by wind and waves. But deep inside, he knew the island had changed.
He left the inn that afternoon, wandering through Old Harbor with his notebook. The village looked brighter somehow, not in color but in spirit. Fishermen laughed on the docks. The scent of bread drifted from the bakery. Even the gulls sounded less like warnings and more like songs. At the harbor, Mara Latham found him sitting on a bench, scribbling furiously. "I thought you might have left," she said. "Not yet. You look like someone who's seen the end of a storm." Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe I have." She sat beside him. "Did you throw it back?" He nodded. "All of it." "Then perhaps the island can finally rest." They sat in silence, watching the ferry glide across the bay. The same ship that had once seemed like a ghost now looked like salvation, bringing new visitors, new beginnings. Mara turned to him. "What will you do now?" "Tell the story, but not the one about ghosts and curses, the one about healing." Over the following weeks, Elias stayed on Block Island longer than planned. He photographed everything: the weathered lighthouses, the green trails of Clayhead, the stone walls winding through wildflowers. He wrote pages of reflections, how the island had endured centuries of storms and silence, how the echoes of pirates and sailors had become part of its rhythm. One evening, he walked back to the North Light, where he'd last seen Jonas. The tower glowed faintly in the sunset, its lens flashing like a heartbeat. The door stood open. Inside, the air was cool and still. On the desk near the lantern sat a notebook, old, leather-bound, with Jonas Pike's name scratched inside the cover. Elias flipped through the pages. They were full of dates, tide records, sketches of the coast, and notes written in a rough but careful hand. "The sea keeps her balance. When the curse is lifted, she'll sleep again. One day someone will come who carries the captain's blood and the island's forgiveness." Elias's hand trembled slightly as he turned the last page. There, pressed between the paper, lay a sprig of dried sea lavender, the same flower that grew only along the northern cliffs. He smiled. "Goodbye, Jonas." Outside, the foghorn sounded once, low and soft, almost like a farewell. As summer waned, Block Island transformed. Word spread of its beauty, its quiet trails, its lighthouse keepers, its timeless charm. The locals restored old cottages into inns, built wooden boardwalks, and reopened the historic Southeast Light, whose beacon had once guided whalers home. Visitors came not for treasure or legend, but for peace. Elias watched it all unfold, camera in hand, documenting the transformation. His article, A Block Island Chronicle, The Sea That Remembers, appeared in a national magazine that fall. It told of storms and shipwrecks, of pirates and lost silver, but more than that, it told of rebirth, of how an haunted island learned to forgive itself. The story went viral. Tourists poured in, drawn by his photographs of sunlit cliffs and violet seas. But those who stayed longer often said the same thing, that sometimes walking alone near the lighthouse, they could still hear faint laughter on the wind. Elias never denied it. One evening, long after the article's success, Elias returned to the cliffs where it had all begun. The sun dipped low, staining the horizon orange and rose. He sat on the edge, camera beside him, the stone with the compass rose still in his pocket. Below, the sea shimmered calmly. No fog, no ghosts, just the eternal rhythm of tide and rock. He whispered, "Thank you." For a moment, he could have sworn he heard a voice in reply, distant like an echo through time. "The island remembers." A gull cried overhead, breaking the silence. The wind smelled of salt and heather. He smiled, took one last photograph, and walked back toward the village lights. Behind him, the last rays of sun caught the lighthouse lens, sending a single beam across the sea, bright and steady, reaching out to the horizon where the crimson wraith had once sailed. Now, it was only light.
Years passed like the tides, steady, unhurried, eternal. The old stories faded into whispers, but the island itself never forgot. By the time Elias Rowan returned to Block Island, 10 years had gone by. His book, A Block Island Chronicle, had become a classic, part travel memoir, part ghost story, part love letter to the sea. Readers often wrote to him, saying they'd come to the island just to feel the quiet he had described. And when they arrived, they found that quiet waiting for them, soft, endless, alive. He stepped off the ferry on a golden afternoon in late August. Old Harbor looked both familiar and new. Victorian inns, their paint fresh and bright, lined the curve of the waterfront. The Harborside Inn, once a worn relic of the 19th century, now gleamed like something from a postcard. Cafes buzzed with visitors sipping lemonade under striped umbrellas. Children chased gulls. Cyclists rolled past with baskets full of seashells. But beneath it all, beneath the music, the laughter, the hum of summer, Elias still felt the old pulse of the island, deep and patient, like the slow beat of the ocean against its heart. He wandered up the hill to the southeast lighthouse, its brick tower glowing in the afternoon sun. From here, the view spread wide. The green hills, the winding stone walls, the trails threading through fields of goldenrod. He could see everything the island had become. Where pirates once hid treasure, there were now walking paths. Where shipwrecks had shattered on the rocks, sailboats now glided smoothly across the waves. The ghosts had not vanished. They had simply grown peaceful. The Woman in the Archives. Elias stopped by the Historical Society, a white clapboard house near Old Harbor. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and salt. A young curator, Elise, no older than 30, recognized him immediately. "You're Elias Rowan. My grandmother used to tell me about your stories. She said you made the island famous again." Elias smiled. "I only listened to what it was already saying." She led him to a small display room filled with relics, fragments of pottery, a rusted compass, and a single gold coin in a glass case. The label read, "Recovered from the wreck of the Crimson Wraith, 1723. Beside it was an old black and white photo. A bearded man standing beside the North Light, his eyes steady and kind. The nameplate read, "Jonas Pike, Keeper of the North Light, 1892 to 1911. Elias felt a chill of recognition. Elise noticed, "He's sort of a legend here. People say he once saved a ship during a storm, but no one knows how." He looked closer. In the photograph, Jonas's hand rested on something, a stone with a carved compass rose. Elias reached into his pocket. The same stone lay there still, smooth from years of carrying it, the markings faint but unbroken. He placed it gently on the glass case beside the coin. "It belongs here," he said softly. Elise blinked. "Is that?" Elias said, "A piece of the island's memory. Keep it safe." That evening, Elias took a walk through Clay Head Trail.
The sky was streaked with indigo and gold, and the air smelled of heather and the sea. He followed the narrow path between stone walls until he reached the cliffs. Below him, waves crashed against the rocks, white spray glimmering like ghosts made of light. He thought of all who had come before, the pirates, the sailors, the lighthouse keepers, the wanderers who had sought fortune or forgiveness on these shores. They were gone, yet not forgotten. Their echoes lived in the wind, in the creak of the grass, in the hush that followed each crashing wave. He raised his camera, the same one he'd carried years ago, and took one last photograph. Click. The lens caught it all: the cliffs, the endless sea, the faint shape of the lighthouse beam stretching into the dusk. For a heartbeat, Elias thought he saw someone standing by the water's edge, a figure in an old mariner's coat, hat brim low, looking out to sea. But when he blinked, it was gone. Only the light remained. The next morning, the island awoke to a sky the color of pearls. Elias stood on the beach, the ferry waiting in the harbor. He bent down and wrote something in the sand, a message that would wash away but not be forgotten. The island remembers. He smiled, turned toward the ferry, and left Block Island for the last time. Behind him, the tide came in. The waves erased his words, but the sea carried them onward, out past the lighthouse, past the reefs, into the wide blue beyond. Years later, tourists still come to Block Island, drawn by whispers of its past. They walk the trails Elias loved, photograph the lighthouses, and listen to the gulls cry over the sea. Sometimes they visit the museum and see the stone and the gold coin, reminders of the Crimson Wraith, the curse, and the keeper who stayed behind. And in the guest books of island inns, they sometimes find notes written in neat, looping handwriting. Listen to the wind near the cliffs. You might hear the sea tell its story. No one knows who writes them, but every evening, as the last ferry departs and the horizon glows like fire, the light from the old North Tower sweeps across the waves, a steady heartbeat in the gathering dusk. It touches every rock, every sail, every shore. And for those who pause and listen closely, the island still speaks, not with fear, but with peace. The pirates are dust, the storms long gone. But the legend, the story of courage, forgiveness, and the sea that remembers, will live as long as the light shines.